Hi guys, welcome back to Mysteries Channel. Thank you so much for clicking on my channel and checking out my videos. I really appreciate it. I have been researching the Chachapoyas of Peru, and in doing so, I came across a book that I find so friggin' interesting and fascinating. I'm sure I'll do plenty of videos on stuff I find from that book, including the Chachapoya video, but before that, I thought I would just share a very interesting story from the book. First, let's go over the book really quick. The book is titled Comentarios Reales de los Incas. This book was written by a man named Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, the first published mestizo writer of colonial Andean South America. He's a very interesting guy with a very interesting story. Basically, he is the son of Captain Sebastian Garcilaso de la Vega y Vargas and an Incan noblewoman named Isabel Suarez Chimpu Oclo, or Pela Chimpu Oclo, depending on if you're Incan addressing her or if you're a Spaniard addressing her. He ends up growing up with his mother and his mother's people until around the age of 10. And during this time, all of their oral traditions are handed to him. He would have been also of noble birth, considering that his mother was a noblewoman. And so a lot of care was taken to make sure that he knew where he came from and the history of his people. When he is 10, his dad comes back again to visit him, and he ends up going back with his dad, traveling around, eventually making it to Spain around the age of 21. The book that I'm talking about, the Comentarios Reales de la Inca, is really a chronicle of the culture, economics, and politics of the Inca Empire, and it's all based on the oral traditions that were handed down to him by his relatives. Eventually, we'll have more stories coming out of this book, but for now, I'm going to tell you a story about some serious bad luck. In the very beginning of this chapter, which is chapter 8, he basically breaks down the 4 boundaries of the realms of the Inca Empire. But before he goes further into the history of Peru, he wants to tell a story, an interesting story that doesn't fit into the other parts of the book, but needs to be told. And I agree with him, the story, it needs to be told. It's the story of Pedro Serrano, ends up on a completely deserted island. Let us begin. It was Pedro Serrano's fate to be wrecked among them and to reach the island swimming. He was in a state of despair, for he found no water, nor fuel, nor even grass that he could graze on, nor anything else to maintain life till some ship might pass to rescue him before he perished from hunger or thirst. This seemed to him a harder fate than death by drowning, which would be quicker. So he spent the first night bewailing his misfortune, and was as cast down as one would suppose a man to be in such a plight. As soon as dawn came, he again walked around the island and found some shellfish from the sea, crabs, shrimp, and other creatures. He caught what he could and he ate them raw, having no flame to roast or boil them with. Thus, he kept himself going until he saw turtles come forth. Seeing them some distance from the sea, he seized one by turning it over and did the same with as many as he could, for they were clumsy in righting themselves when on their back. Drawing a knife he used to wear in his belt, and which saved his life, he beheaded one and drank its blood instead of water. He did the same with the rest and laid out their flesh in the sun to make dried meat, and cleaned out the shells to catch rainwater, for the whole region, of course, is very rainy. Thus, he sustained himself during the first days by killing all the turtles he could. Some were as big and bigger than the biggest shields, and others smaller. They were, in fact, of all sizes. The largest of them he could not contrive to turn over on their backs because they were stronger than he was. And though he climbed on them to subdue them by tiring them out, it was of no use because they could make their way to the sea with him astraddle. So experience taught him which turtles he could attack and which to abandon. In their shells he collected a great deal of water, for some could hold 2 arrobas, others less. Finding himself adequately supplied with food and drink, Pedro Serrano thought that if he could make fire so as to be able to roast his food and produce smoke in case ships could pass, he could lack nothing. With this idea, being a man of long experience of the sea, he looked for a pair of pebbles that he could use as flint, hoping to use his knife to strike fire from them. But not finding any such stones on the island, which was covered with bare sand, he swam to the sea and dived carefully, searching the sea bottom in all directions, and persisting in his labors until he found pebbles and collected what he could, picking out the best and breaking them on one another so as to make edges to strike the knife on. He then tried out his idea, and seeing that he could strike fire, made shreds of pieces of his shirt, torn very small like carded cotton. This served as tinder, and by the dint of industry and skill, after great perseverance, he made himself a fire. Having got it, he counted himself fortunate and sustained it by collecting all the jet sand thrown up by the sea. He spent hours collecting weeds called seed pods, timber from ships lost at sea, shells, fish bones, and other material to feed his fire. So that showers would not extinguish it, he made a hut with the biggest shells from the turtles that he killed and tended the fire with great diligence lest it should slip from his hands. Within 2 months or less, he was as naked as the day he was born. For the great rain, the heat, the humidity of the region rotted the clothes that he had. The sun wearied him with its great heat, for he had no clothes to protect himself, nor any shade. When he was very extenuated, he entered the water and submerged himself. He lived there 3 years, amidst the hardships and cares. And though he saw several ships pass in that time, and made smoke, they did not see him, or else they feared the shoals and did not dare approach, but passed well out to sea. All of which left Pedro Serrano so discouraged that he had resigned himself to dying and ending his misery. Owing to the harshness of the climate, hair grew all over his body till it was like an animal's pelt, and not just any animal's, but a wild boar's. His hair and his beard fell below his waist. After 3 years, one afternoon when he wasn't expecting anything, he saw a man on the island. This man had been wrecked on the shoals the night before and had saved himself on a ship's plank. As soon as dawn appeared, he saw the smoke of Pedro Serrano's fire, and guessing what it was, made for it, aided by the plank and his good swimming. When they saw one another, it was hard to say which was more surprised. Serrano thought it was the devil come in human form to tempt him into some desperate act. His guest thought Serrano was the devil in his true form. He was so coated with hair, beard, and hide. Each fled from one another, and Pedro Serrano went off crying, "Jesus, Jesus, O Lord, deliver me from the demon." Hearing this, the other was reassured and turned toward him, saying, "Flee me not, brother, for I am Christian too." And to prove it, as he still ran away, shouted the credo. Pedro Serrano heard it and turned back, and they advanced with the greatest tenderness and many tears and groans, seeing that they were both in the same plight with no hope for escape. Each briefly told the other the story of his past life. Pedro Serrano, realizing his guest's needs, gave him some of his food and drink, which comforted him a little. They then again discussed their plight. They arranged their life as best they could, dividing the hours of the day and night between the duties of collecting shellfish to eat, sea pods and wood and fish bones, and anything else thrown up by the sea to sustain the fire, and especially the perpetual vigil they needed to keep on it, hour by hour, lest it go out. They lived this way for some days, but it was not long before they quarreled so violently that they lived apart and nearly came to blows. The cause of the strife was that one accused the other of not doing the necessary duties properly. This accusation and the words they exchanged were enough to destroy their harmony and divide them, but they themselves soon realized their folly and asked one another's forgiveness, made friends, and lived together again. Thus, they continued for 4 years. During this time, they saw some ships pass by and made their smoke signals, but in vain. And this so depressed them that they all but died. At the end of this long time, a ship chanced to pass so near that their smoke was sighted, and that ship put out a boat to pick them up. Pedro Serrano and his companion, who had grown a similar pelt, seeing the boat approach, fell to saying the credo and calling the name of our Redeemer aloud so that the sailors would not think they were demons and flee from them. This availed them, for otherwise the mariners would doubtless have fled. They no longer looked like human beings. And so they were carried to the ship, where they astounded all who saw and heard their labors. The companion died at sea, returning to Spain. Pedro Serrano reached there and went on to Germany, where the emperor then was. He kept his pelt as it was, as a proof of his wreck and all he had gone through. In every village he passed through on the way, he earned much money, wherever he chose to exhibit himself. Some of the lords and principal knights who liked to see his figure contributed toward the cost of the journey, and his imperial majesty, having seen and heard him, gave him a reward of 4,000 pesos in income, or 4,800 ducats in Peru. On the way to enjoy this, he died at Panama and never saw it. All this story, as I have repeated it, is told by the gentleman called Sanchez de Figueroa, who from I heard it. He knew Pedro Serrano and warrants that he had heard it from him, and that after seeing the emperor, Pedro Serrano cut his hair and beard just above the waist to enable himself to sleep at night. He plaited it, for otherwise it spread out over the bed and disrupted his rest. I don't know. I just thought it was too good not to share. It's just an interesting story that I'd never heard of. Anyway, that's really all I have for today. I hope you guys have yourselves a very great day.